In this tutorial, I will explain how to work with a feature called User Tours in ORM. This feature can be very useful if you want to explain to the user what your application shows on a particular screen by guiding the user through each element on the screen and providing an explanation for each element. This is hard to explain without an example, so let me show a user tour in action. Here I have the photo album sample application that includes a tour. A tour marks a particular element on the screen with a red marker and a number. One marker is always active, and you can see the explanation of the element at the bottom of the screen. The user can navigate between markers by pressing the arrow button here. When this happens, the active marker changes so that the user can see the element on the screen and the corresponding explanation. If an element is located off the screen, ORM will automatically scroll the screen when the marker becomes active, so that the element is visible to the user. So going through a tour, the user gets a pretty good idea what the screen consists of and how to work with the screen. The user can turn the tour off by pressing this button here, and then turn it back on if necessary. Now that we understand what tours are about, let's see what the developer has to do in ORM to configure them. A tour consists of sections. Each section includes the unique ID of the element on the screen. This element will be marked by a marker, and an explanation of the section that will be displayed when the section becomes active. Tours can be attached to queries to guide the user through the columns and operations of a query. We have to go to the burger menu in the display details of the query to set up a tour. Tours can also be attached to forms to guide the user through the fields and operations of the form. And again, we should go to the burger menu to set up the tour. And tours can be attached to visual perspectives to guide the user through tabs and/or content panels of a visual perspective, and also the contents of the content panels if necessary. To set up a tour of a visual perspective, we go to the burger menu of the visual perspective here. In each case, the same tour dialog is displayed. In this dialog, the developer adds sections to the tour. For each section, you have to provide the ID of the element being marked, the explanation, indicate where the marker will be located relative to the element, and if a tour is for a visual perspective and the section explains a content panel that contains a form or query, and this form or query has its own tour, it is possible to include this tour as a subtour of the current tour by ticking this checkbox here. The only part that probably needs further explanation here is the ID of the element being marked in the section. You can assign IDs to many elements in ORM. Cells in forms that may include attributes or other form elements. This is the place where you can specify the ID. Form sections. Panel operations used in forms or queries. This is where you can specify the ID of the operation. Item operations in queries. Columns in queries. Content panels in visual perspectives. Tabs in visual perspectives. HTML elements used in content panels, form cells, and so on. To assign IDs to HTML elements, use the standard ID attribute of an HTML element. For example, you can assign any text to the ID of the element. The only requirement is that the ID must be unique within the tour where it is used. When you define a section of a tour, AwareAIM automatically collects all IDs contained within the form, query, or visual perspective for which the tour is being defined, and presents it to the developer to choose from. As an example, let's look at how the tour in the photo album sample application that we have just seen has been configured. The tour is defined for the visual perspective, which is displayed when an author logs in. So we have to go to the author visual perspective, and I have it here on the screen. So we go to the tour definition, and we can see that the tour consists of two sections. The first section has the ID album tree. This is the ID of the first content panel, called albums. We can see this ID here. Going back to the tour of the visual perspective, we can see that the include tour of the element shown in the content panel checkbox is ticked. This means that the section includes the tour of the query or form that the content panel includes. If we look at the content panel again, we can see that it contains query album for logged in author. If we go to this query, we can see that it contains its own tour. The tour of the query includes IDs of the panel operations of the query. If we look at the panel operation, we can see the ID here. Once again, let's have a look how this is shown to the user. Here I will only go through the markers of the first section. The first marker provides explanation for the content panel. And markers 2 and 3 come from the tour of the query contained in this content panel, which is used as a sub-tour here. Going back to the tour of the visual perspective, we can see that the ID of the second section is called Selected Album. Note also that the include tour of the element showed in the content panel checkbox is ticked for this section. The ID shown in the second section is the ID of the second content panel called Album. We can see this ID here. This content panel is initially empty, but when the user selects an album, it shows the form of the author object called Image Gallery. If we look at the form, we can see that it has its own tour, and the tour goes through the operations of the form. So just like the previous section, the tour marks the content panel first, and then marks the panel operations of the form contained in the panel. The last thing I wanted to mention about tours is that you can make a tour conditional by specifying an applicability condition. For example, display the tour for one category of users only, but not other categories.